at a one-to-one scale, privileging computational design strategies over the use of the computer as a mere tool for representation. The goal is for the students to develop rules for the formal manipulation and assembly of the material systems as a form of low-tech analog software designed to exploit inherent properties of those materials. Error as mistake may be the most common understanding of error that we encounter in the studio, but mistakes are too easily rationalized and discarded. In general, the process depends upon a productively naive, intuitive, and error-prone, quasi-scientific investigation of material behavior under various conditions, the rules that the students determine themselves. These rules then become the protocols of the investigations. The students are challenged to question preconceived notions. They often base evaluation of their own work on comparison with an idealized geometry or a perfect result that continually eludes them to their great frustration. This only impedes their capacity to observe how the materials react to the imposition of their protocols. So we ask them specifically to focus on the possibilities presented by unexpected behaviors and perceived errors, and to learn how to repeat them, and then to make them generative. This project employed plaster cast in catenary arcs over a stretchable fabric core, but the problem was that the plaster broke into little pieces when the fabric core was removed. An investigation of the edge geometries led to a program for the broken pieces recombination. And here I should pause to credit Cameron Nelson and Jenny Sabin's 2020 paper, Shape Programmed Self-Assembly of Bead Structures, as a really important reference. So in the studio, error in its many forms is embraced as modus operandi, rather than as a device to sort and exclude the messy or the unexpected result. For these inflatable studies, the students were asked to begin by creating an inflatable Euclidean form. But we knew this would be impossible, and they did not. Of course, all of the polyhedra tend toward the spherical when inflated. This led to the introduction of various modes of restraining the faces of the inflatables, and then to the creation of proto-digital pneumatics. Next, the concept of the outlier adds a spatial component to error. In order to write the introduction to the ACADIA 2020 proceedings, I did a keyword analysis of the final papers to understand to what extent the conference themes had been incorporated and how issues of current relevance might have been addressed in the conference's output. More distant and therefore less concrete, the contribution of the outlier is also more easily dismissed as a mistake. This is the graphic that appears in the 2020 proceedings, based on counts of 33 curated keywords drawn from the conference theme and the call for papers. We can easily see the prevalence of certain words. Robotics appeared the most, while gender appeared the least, but seeing connections between papers is not really possible. I was also puzzled by the uniformity of the distribution of what we called the marshmallows, the shapes that represent conference content on the platform. I would have expected to see more clumping from the T-SNE algorithm used for the visualization. So I decided to look at different ways of mapping the keywords to see if the uniformity of the online platform repeated across different graphs. I was looking for clumping, but also interested to see the outliers. The same proximity criteria are used for all of these graphs to visualize the groupings, and actually had to be set at a relatively large distance in order to start to see any connections. But since the study is based on a handful of selected words rather than the bag of words analysis used for the web platform, we do start to see a bit more clumping and the appearance of some outliers, which actually represent different papers in different graphs. This graph on the right uses the same XYZ coordinates for the papers as were used for the online visualization. And thanks to Oliver Popovich for sending me the information. Since all of this is based on the appearance of certain features within the papers, what interests me are the narratives that are latent but unwritten. How might we see different groupings if the research were situated differently, if the unseen outlier features were made more central and explicit. Outliers can have critical importance to amplifying counter-narratives. In the last few years, we've seen the emergence and elevation of critical voices in both the work presented at ACADIA and thanks to my colleagues' amazing curation of keynote conversations, the conference speakers as well. This is absolutely incredible. Part 3, Situated Methodologies. I recently read a paper in which the authors included a section called Situated Selves. In it, they position themselves critically, beyond their bios. This highlights the importance of the questions that we ask ourselves. I hope I succeeded in hinting at the following with the last example that I showed. Our own critical positioning is a crucial component to how we interpret the results of our investigations, how we actually see or fail to see outliers, even the methodologies we choose to employ. I think this deserves to be documented more explicitly. I have in mind Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledges, which calls for the embodied objectivity of partial, locatable, critical knowledges. And so returning for a moment to take another look at error, and specifically to its previously unmentioned configuration as failure. I wanted to briefly show an ongoing investigation that takes on the idea of failed orientations, both in terms of its critical theoretical positioning, as well as in terms of its methodologies. In her book, Queer Phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed refers to orientation as in sexuality, but also in terms of the geometric relationships between objects, between proximity and outlier, and how we orient or fail to orient ourselves in white heteronormative spaces. Next, I show this clip because it illustrates cinematically this sense of disorientation. As her body moves, we share the experience of her misregistration within the space of the corridor. My investigation, Wild Simulations, starts with an analysis of several of Francis Bacon's paintings. The one in the center is titled Head 1 from 1948. The objects within the painting evidence the instantiation of multiple conflicting spatial conditions, each with its own vanishing point, with its own horizon. This has the effect of a systematic dismantling of a singular normative three-dimensional space. This and the images that follow are the result of my attempt to translate Bacon's methodology to a digital environment. The subject is dismantled and reconstituted, fit into a space warped by the conflicting spaces of the frame of the painting. Purposefully wild assemblages, the misregistered coordinate systems affect the apparent disfiguration of Bacon's foregrounded figures. And the same happens here to the virtual forms via the operations in the script. But these explicitly carnal effects are evidence of an implicit violence, not a mutilation, but of an imperfect simultaneity. Rather than a deconstruction or dissection of the figure, what we witness instead is a corporal oscillation, the result of the queer body's failure to occupy multiple spatial paradigms simultaneously. Things just don't line up. Each of Bacon's works can be understood as performative in that they are not merely figurative representations, but analog devices that operate on the subjects contained, simulating a complex queer spatial practice, while at the same time serving as an emphatic rejection of a hermeneutics of normative space. This last image is actually the result of an error in the script. The subject is distorted to ridiculous proportions as it fails to cohere, because it is erroneously mapped to all subdivisions of the space. But it struck me that the
of that.
Yes, sorry.
Hi everyone. First,
No
I want to
worries.
thank everyone at ACADIA, and especially the board. I'm humbled and profoundly moved by this honor, and I take it as motivation to continue the work, to be worthy of this recognition. The subject is distorted to ridiculous proportions as it fails to cohere, because it is erroneously mapped to all subdivisions of the space. But it struck me that the error, in fact, performs with more fidelity than the quote-unquote successful script. Failure as queer practice is the subject of a great deal of writing in the realm of queer theory, from Jose Esteban Munoz to Jack Halberstam and many others. I'm interested in how this might be explored, specifically in terms of computation and architecture. Jacob Gaburi has also written extensively on the history of queer computing. And you'll have to forgive me for just reading this, but paraphrasing will not do it justice. Our belief in technical progress asks us to ignore the bugs, glitches, and obsolescence built into technical systems. Moreover, it asks us to limit our use of these objects to their most productive forms and to deny any use outside these sanctioned boundaries, disavowing them as somehow failed. Under these terms, failure becomes much more than an unfortunate or unseen error. It becomes a refusal of this impulse toward compulsory production, a disruptive withholding of one's identity, activity, and process time. Indeed, we might argue that the production of failure within technological systems in this way constitutes a radical queer practice. So having opened the discussion to the critical positioning of the research then brings us to methods. Methodologies are transitive and can be critically deployed. In this light, Benjamin Haber seeks a place for an expansion of queer method beyond the qualitative to the quantitative. And again, I apologize because I'm going to read this because I couldn't say it any better or more succinctly. Queer theory must seriously engage with quantitative systems of worldly awareness and not only through critical resistance. I want to begin to imagine what queer method might look like beyond a discursive toolkit to complicate the friendliest of qualitative methods. A queer method that takes on the violence, exclusion, and homogenization of calculative infrastructures in the closed systems of data capitalism, but is reflexive enough to recognize some of its values embedded in them as well. So I'd like to close with this excerpt from a letter written by Alan Turing amidst his prosecution for gross indecency in 1952. His biographer, Andrew Hodges, described him as a, quote, English, atheist, homosexual mathematician, unquote. So if we allow a purposefully naive yet situated reading of this text as an actual mathematical statement, Turing uses it, in essence, to prove that artificial intelligence is not possible by employing his own queer counter-narrative as negation. He uses it, sarcastically, as a tool to decry the dismissal of his work based on his sexuality. But further, and perhaps more interestingly, he turns his failed orientation into a logical operator. And even though not used in the affirmative, he nevertheless obliges us to see his counter-narrative as both highly relevant and essential to his methodology. Turing's formulation of this postulate exemplifies the kind of queer practice to which I would like to call attention, and hopefully to amplify through my own work. In recent years, ACADIA too has worked to foster a more critical infrastructure, amplifying sometimes latent narratives. And these adjustments have the power to become, in Easterling's words, contagious. Thank you so much. It's been a great honor.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Hi, Viola.
Hi, Brian. Can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure that voice and video are on.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, we'll get started. I wanted to thank Jane, who is now backstage, I think, for the wonderful introduction. Brian, thank you for that fantastic presentation. It's encouraging and it's also, I'm going to say, inspiring. It's one of those presentations that you watch and then afterwards you just want to get back to your work and start working right away. So I also want to take this moment to congratulate you, most importantly, on the award. I genuinely cannot think of a better recipient. So congratulations. And also for somebody who has been following your work for some years now, I do have the privilege of knowing how well deserved this award is.
Thank you. No, really, this means so much. So thanks very much.
I also wanted to thank Acadia for a quick, brief moment before we jump into our conversation. Firstly, for inviting me to converse with you, Brian, on this very important day and event. It's an honor for sure, and it's also a pleasure. And with that, also thank you to the conference chairs. Brian and I both know the effort required for such an amazing event. So congratulations to you also. And maybe before we jump in, I wanted to just maybe make like another couple of notes on the video presentation as we begin our discussion from kind of like appreciative standpoint. I really enjoyed the kind of deep dive into the lineage of your work, Brian, and not just the sort of like the snippets of your work that I've known as sort of like isolated instantiations. So from your student work to your own work to co-chairing conferences and so on. So I think it's really important to see the kind of the expansive thematic and experimental discoveries with this kind of like wide lens that the presentation provided so clearly. In addition, I also wanted to comment on and I use this term in the best way possible, the seriousness, or maybe something that sometimes we refer to as rigorousness, robustness, and so on. But I would prefer the term seriousness that your presentation put forward. And it's a kind of, it's a tone by which you present your work and your research. So as I already mentioned, it is encouraging to watch that. So I'm really grateful that you shared that with all of us today. And if I had the virtual applause thing, I would probably put that on right now.
Thanks, Yolanda.
All right, so we'll just dig right into it.
Yeah, just first, I want to just take a second because, well, thanks to you, because it's been a pleasure to work with you, and you've always been so encouraging. But also, I want to thank. I want to thank my family, who I think are watching right now, and I'm not sure. So they've always been very supporting, and my husband as well, who's watching separately. But also, I need to thank Pablo Kobayashi, with whom I co-chaired the 2018 conference, and with whom I co-teach, our assistants, Lucia Auman, Emilio Robles, Ernesto Falabella, and past contributors, Luis Carbonell and Alberto Vivar, that I didn't get a chance to thank in the presentation. And of course, all the many students whose work you saw in the presentation. So thanks to all of them, because obviously without the students, all of that work, it wouldn't be possible for me to show that work and to do the explorations that we do. So anyway, thanks to everyone.
No, and I particularly appreciated that a lot of the times, like some of these ideas we do test, and that kind of it all sort of blends in together pedagogically from the leadership position and so on. So I think it's also it is really important to talk about that as well. And I like that it was sort of kind of blended into the presentation. It wasn't just like an isolated moment that was not necessarily related to the work in such profound ways. Okay, so maybe I think it might be helpful to kind of start the conversation by asking to either maybe clarify or re-summarize once again this idea of the lineage of error in your work. As it spans the different avenues that you described in your presentation. So that is from like conference chairing to editor to author to designer to educator. And maybe, I think more importantly, to a kind of instigator or a critical thinker from a position of like starting to ask these kinds of questions. So if that's, and I know the presentation made it very clear, but if you want to maybe summarize in another few words that kind of lineage of error, I think.
Sure. No, I mean, I think it's a really good question, because I mean, in the format of the presentation, it's not, I mean, maybe it could have been clear, but I mean, it kind of all starts from practice. I mean, I was a project architect, which is kind of like more on the technical side, for 20 years before I moved to Mexico. And and I had to deal with material tolerances all the time, and specifically like having to think what could possibly go wrong, like what could be, what errors there could be. And so, you know, when I picked up Francesca Hughes's book, it was like I mean, it was like a revelation, because it really made me think in a different way about these subjects. And then when I moved to Mexico and started teaching, and especially you know, a couple of years after I started teaching, when I teamed up with Pablo and we started working with more analog materials, which is what Pablo had been doing before I joined him teaching. I mean, it really became evident that it was something, you know, this kind of like what we expect materials to do and what they actually do, and the problems that it causes, and the architects need to control that, and our communication of that to our students, like it just kind of perpetuates this paradigm that I think that Francesca Hughes so eloquently rails against in the book, and it really made me look at it in a different way. And so kind of like, it was kind of serendipity that the opportunity to work with ACADIA sort of came at the, like, as I was really literally, as I was finishing the book and kind of making these connections between error and practice, you know, looking at modernism, and like it really became about like an appearance of precision rather than actual precision, because the levels of precision, as Francesca Hughes talks about it, are so great in the tools that we use now that it's not possible in construction to actually achieve those. And so, like, you know, that was very present in my mind, and also with Pablo at the time of the organization of the conference in 2018. And so we really wanted to highlight that. And then, you know, consequently, it kind of comes back into my own work in these other projects about like opening myself up to the possibilities of my own mistakes, you know, and really living what we preach to our students. And specifically with the Bacon project, it's something that had started way before and took up again. And actually, you know, I kind of got back to error through the Bacon investigation, because I started reading more queer theory and queer phenomenology at that time, which you know, has a huge amount of scholarship on failure and error as queer practices. And so it's like, it's not something that came, you know, kind of full circle for me. So
yeah, it's actually I think like in line with that, I think there's also a type of non-planned or per chance kind of condition that comes into play as well, because it's you know, had you had known like 10 years ago, for example, that you were going to co-chair a conference and sort of like come up with a theme, like you know what I mean? Like maybe that trajectory would have been a little bit different, but I think that because these things sort of like arise and you naturally gravitate towards these things, then they in turn help you develop this question even more. And it's really interesting that you're saying that you mentioned that like things have kind of come back, that you've started to work on something and they've sort of like remerged. So with that, I actually want to zoom out a little bit for a slightly biographical take, because I know a little bit about your background, and I want to ask more from a selfish standpoint, and also I think the kind of the sort of juxtaposition is really, really interesting. So you kind of started with that too. There was a slide where it showed your non-traditional trajectory in your journey in the field. So I think it's we should do a due diligence. So according to my memory, I think that you were in New York studying at Columbia. I thought it was the 2000s, but we'll leave those years aside for a second, you know. And then, as you mentioned, you were working as a PA for 20 years before moving and living in Mexico City. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to some of these immersive themes from the time that you were a student and a young professional, and how these themes kind of stayed. Maybe they were sort of like left behind for a bit and re-emerged, and how they've changed with this journey in the profession and the discipline.
Sure. Yeah, it was the 90s, Viola. It was not the 2000s.
We don't need details.
Extra decade. But yeah, I mean, I was at Columbia in the early 90s, and as we've talked about before, like my last semester or last year, I can't remember if it was last year or last semester, was the first paperless studio at Columbia, and you could only get in by lottery, and I didn't get in. So, you know, my entire education was, you know, what now would be old school. I mean, I didn't touch a computer really, except to do word processing stuff until after I graduated and had been out of school for several years. And then, yeah, I was a project architect for 20 years, and I had always kind of like thought about teaching, but it wasn't given, you know, I wasn't really given an opportunity until I moved to Mexico. And, you know, talk about life presenting challenges and opportunities. When I graduated from Columbia, I never would have thought of moving to Mexico, but life presents challenges and opportunities. And so, you know, in my mid 40s, I picked up and moved to Mexico. I learned Spanish. I started teaching, and I started working for a different kind of practice, and eventually turned into having my own practice. And so, like, you know, jumping back to the previous question, also, I think that like having, you know, had this kind of like highly technical New York big firm background, doing big high-tech facades, you know, I was really interested in these high-tech facades. And then moving to Mexico, it was a shock to the system in many different ways, but also like a great kind of like prompt. And if you could say like a big life change as a prompt, an intellectual prompt, but you know, back to this idea of ad hocism that I had been started working on before the Landscapes of Quarantine thing. And then, you know, again, coming full circle, like all of these ideas of kind of like a situated practice or an identity-based practice in terms of like queer theory or feminist theory. Well, first of all, in the early 90s, like, I mean, maybe I'm sure there are a lot of people that know more about this than I do that could correct me, but it was really like in the late 80s. I mean, Donna Haraway wrote that Situated Knowledges in 1988. There's like queer studies programs just developing at about that time. And it was not really even on my radar. I mean, I was all, you know, concerned at that time more with my own personal narrative than any kind of like intellectual rationalizing. But it is strange how, like, you know, these ideas can come back up later in life that you'd been tossing around earlier. I guess, I don't know.
Yeah. I wonder if that move from the kind of the high-tech facade type of design work and construction work in very much like a kind of global scene, right? And that transition from that position to, I'm half remembering a quote from the introduction in the 2018 book, the sort of to maybe paying attention to, I think like local richness and expertise or something. I think like maybe this kind of transition might have been in line with you returning to some of this work on error and imperfection to some kind of degree.
No, and infrastructures as well, because I mentioned in the tropicalization paper that, you know, because of NAFTA, actually, there are manufacturers in Mexico who produce products to be sold in the United States, and like, especially I use the example of doors, like hollow metal doors are produced in Mexico for sale in the United States. So projects in Mexico actually use imperial measurements for the doors, because Mexico is in the metric system, but, you know, so all of the plans have these strange dimensions for doors because they're Mexican produced doors, but they're based on the infrastructure to be sold in the United States. So we have to kind of like normalize the system here. And it's, you know, these little ways become, you know, little hegemonies in the local system, and seeing how people get around that in practice here is really interesting. And I think that those strategies of like kind of adapting and having to deal with that and developing structures that try to subvert that in a way, or like, you know, the idea of doing knockoffs. I mean, people knock off things here all the time. And so it's like there's a fine line between kind of like, because labor is so much cheaper here than importing stuff than, knocking something off or doing a faithful copy or your own iteration, however you want to say it, to avoid intellectual property issues. Like those structures and how people go about doing that, I think is super interesting and something that should be valued instead of something that is looked down upon. And I think that in practice, even here, people look down upon that as a kind of necessary or dirty way of dealing with the practice, when actually I think that kind of like flexibility of dealing with these systems, that in a way, like if you tweaked it a little bit, it become even more subversive. That would have ripple effects for these other kind of structures that get imposed. So anyway.
Yeah, and I also wonder if, in a way, if I were to kind of like evaluate these, like I would actually say that these infrastructures are even more intelligent because they have to find different sets of resources and different sets of places of operation, even in order to kind of like go around some of these kind of existing like rigid like structures in order to discover new ways of operating and making and breaking into that kind of like infrastructure, right? So
Yes.
I would argue that they're actually even more intelligent in that sense. Okay, so maybe to continue in this, or maybe to go back rather to this question of maybe the other or the thing that we typically look down upon, or things that have been things that we have inherited from like the high modernists or other eras that were not so kind to us now. So I'm thinking maybe like expanding a little bit further on the question of, and I know I'm about to use not just a loaded term, but a super important and urgent term, the question of diversity in the field, for example. So as institutions, primarily, I want to say institutions in the West have been struggling with this matter for some time, different kinds of capacities. And I think some have been more successful than others, unfortunately, meaning that others should be just as successful. I'm thinking about your work as it relates to mandates such as affirmative action. So more specifically, pulling from your presentation, I'm wondering if you can sort of like re-summarize this agency specifically of like the feminist critiques and queer theories in your work and your position, not just as the architectural designer, educator, and so on, but also as Brian, and where that sort of where that has set like from the beginning to now, or maybe now more than the beginning. Up to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question.
It's a multi-part question, sorry.
Yes, and with some thorny subjects. But, well, like I kind of started to say before, like as I was coming into the practice, this, and I don't mean for this to be in any way critical, because I really admire the work that was being done back then, but this kind of identity architecture, I guess, for lack of a better word, and I don't mean that to sound pejorative, but like a queer architecture or a feminist architecture, it was just not something that was present for me, and it may. So that's something that has kind of been more recent in my work, and surprising to me as much as anybody, because it kind of came from an interest that I'd had prior to that with Francis Bacon, but trying to understand the work of Francis Bacon, so that it came to like help me to understand a certain part of like not so much kind of like identity practice, because I think goes beyond saying like, well, I'm a queer architect, therefore the architecture that I make is queer. I think that is can be applicable and powerful in its own way, but I think that like, and it goes to something that I'm like where I am right now in the research on the wild simulations Bacon project, is that this transition from kind of like a situated criticality that has to do with your own personal positioning to a positioning of the methodology that then starts to become a little bit separated from the identity of the actual subject of the or the person who's doing the research, or the team that's doing the research, or the objects of the research themselves, into a kind of like critical thinking about the methods that we use to do that. And so that like in that way, it opens up a world of possibilities for, even, for other narratives to be present, to recognize other narratives within our own work. And so like feminist and queer narratives within my own work, which I realized that, with this idea about error, we're kind of always latent, but like and you might say that this is a revisionist history, and maybe that will probably be a valid criticism, but it's something that like all of a sudden, as with the reading of Hughes's book on error, it's like, there are facts that are always there and always present, but you learn to see them in a different way. And so, so this kind of situated, going from a kind of situated critical position to a more situated selection of methodologies is kind of, I think it's like very important, and I don't know what that landscape actually is, and that's why I kind of end the presentation more open-endedly. But yeah, I see Jane coming on, so.
Are we running out of time?
But I mean, I think it's good if we have to end there. It's kind of good to end there because exploring these different ways that, because as I say, I hint at in the presentation that methodologies are more transitive, and I really appreciated actually Shelby Doyle and Nick Sensky's presentation of in Field Notes about kind of this circuits about like divorcing the methodologies and publishing the methodologies separately, because I think that I mean, I don't know if that's the solution, but I think that could be one way of like making these things more explicit. But then also I really like this idea of the situated selves with, adding like positioning of the narratives in, and I think that making these things explicit and can, help everyone to like, pick and choose tools and understand where this all comes from, or potentially understand where other researchers are coming from in the selection of their methodologies. I don't know, it's really open-ended.
No, that makes perfect sense. Hi, Jane, we're out of time.
Hi, I'm so sorry we're out of time. I feel like all I'm doing is stopping these incredible conversations, but that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much to both of you. Congratulations, Brian. And also thank you so much, Viola. That was, such an interesting conversation. So we're going to have a really short break now, and then we're going to come back in for our final keynote, which is going to be another fantastic session. So thanks again to both Viola, and congratulations to Brian. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the final keynote session, which will be starting shortly.
Thanks so much, Jane. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.